everyone. So for today's video, I want to talk about what survived over winter in my container garden and what didn't. I would love to be sitting outside right now and actually showing you as I talk through each of these, but the weather has not made that possible. It has been a very interesting April so far weather-wise. I think we're even supposed to get snow tomorrow, but as long as my tulips make it through, I will be happy. So I'm going to stay inside and go over what lived and what didn't, but I will be inserting clips of the plants that I'm talking about as I go through them. And yes, I do have a list here of all the different plants just so I wouldn't forget any as I'm going through this. But first, let me kind of talk about what my overwintering plan was, or what my original plan was that I then had to rethink. So originally, I had a plastic greenhouse that I got on Amazon. It was a pretty good size, and I set that up in my garden. I put all of the pots inside of it, and based on the limited time I had it, it did seem like it kept it fairly warm. I mean, not warm, but warmer than the outside, cool enough that the plants who like a bit of cold period will be happy, and then not expose them to the absolutely freezing weather that we typically get here each winter. So I had that all set up. I think I had it for about a month, maybe even. I don't know if it lasted a full month before we had some really strong winds and it picked it up like a sail and it was bouncing around on the deck. So it was weighted down to the deck, and the pieces of the greenhouse that were weighted down were still on the deck, but the wind was so strong. I mean, it's strong anyways, but then being on a rooftop deck, it's even stronger. It ripped the metal poles in half. So I realized that was not going to work. And since it was, I think it was November when that happened, I basically just clustered all of my pots together in the corner of my deck that's closest to the house so that it stayed a little bit warmer. And I crossed my fingers and hoped for the best. Now, it's really been the last 2 to 3 weeks that I'm finally able to tell what has lived and what hasn't. You know, the plants have been pretty dormant until the last few weeks when it started to warm up slightly here. And basically I can tell if things are sprouting, if there's green coming back, or if they've turned into a ball of mush in the container. And that's given me a pretty good idea of whether it has survived or not. In fact, I think there's only one plant that has maybe not lived, but I'm not yet sure of yet. So I'll keep you updated on that. But now let's go ahead and I will talk through the plants that I attempted to overwinter, which one survived, which one didn't, and then at the end, I will tell you what I'm going to do next year. So this is the first time I've had this many perennials or things to overwinter in my container garden. I think last year I maybe had at most 5 to 6 plants, and this year I had somewhere between 20 and 30 plants. Last fall was also the first time that I planted bulbs in my containers, hoping that they would come back this spring. So I was trying out a bunch of new things in my garden, and even if I've lost some plants in the process, at least I know what to do for the future. So let's go through and we'll start off with the bulbs that I planted, because that's where I think I've lost the most types of plants. In fact, I don't know if I've lost anything that wasn't a bulb. So what has survived? The tulip cutting collection, which is in the back bed, I believe. The long stem perennial tulip super bag, which is in the main center bed. And then tulip acuminata, I think that's how you pronounce it, which is just in a small black pot. So basically, all of my tulip bulbs seem to have survived. The only thing that I think didn't survive that could be a tulip is whatever I planted in the far bed in the corner, except I have no idea what it was that I planted, and I don't have any of it on video. So there's some that are poking up. I did find a mushy one in that back raised bed, but other than that, I don't know exactly what I planted. But overall, it seems like the tulips were able to handle outside. And again, they were in the largest raised beds, which just the size of those containers could have been helpful in terms of keeping them a bit warmer, not getting too waterlogged with the size of the container. But I did have them in a round, small black pot as well, which one of the other bulbs died in. So it's hard to say if it's 100% the tulips themselves are just hardier than the other bulbs I planted, or if the containers had something to do with it, but again, they were in one of the smaller containers. Now, as far as the other bulbs I've planted, one that seems to be coming back is the Victoria Falls iris. and that one does have some green from it. It actually had started sprouting in the fall, was dormant through the winter, and then some green leaves have now appeared this year as well. This is also in a smaller yellow container. The other iris I planted, which was the Obsidian Reblooming Bearded Iris, it's still in its pot. It does feel a little squishy to the touch. It's not rotted, so it's not like falling apart and mushy, but it is definitely squishy. I don't see any green growth yet, so I'm counting that as a loss, but I'm gonna keep it in the garden until I guess I'm willing to accept that it is in fact not going to grow this year. And then there was also some daffodils that I planted. Those were in, I think, the same black pot that the tulips were in, not the same pot, the exact duplicate of that pot that the tulips were in that have survived, but the daffodils didn't seem to. Now I dug down and there were some that were definitely lost. There were some that felt, again, slightly squishy, but still firm enough to maybe survive. So I put those into a different pot with just drier soil to see if that would help, and they haven't bloomed yet. So I'm gonna assume, again, the daffodils did not make it. I also had a purple dynamite fritillaria, and that one just basically disintegrated into mush. So that's why I feel like it was definitely more moisture that was the issue, not necessarily the cold, because pretty much everything else survived, and I'll go into detail about which plants those include. And I feel like if it was just the cold, then more of the plants would have been damaged. And I did see one of them start to sprout in kind of the late winter, early spring when it started to get warmer, and then it died and turned to mush. So we had a lot of rain, it had sprouted earlier, now it's no longer sprouting, so I think it's more so the moisture than it is the cold weather, but you can never be 100% sure. So those are the bulbs that I had overwintered, and the bulbs seem to be the ones that were most negatively impacted by being left out in the cold and the rain. Next, I'll go over some of my edibles. So my blueberry plant and raspberry plant, those are both budding up nicely. This is the second winter that they've been left out. So I planted those in fall 2020. So winter 2020, winter 2021, they've come back just fine both years. And those I did not move over to the corner of the deck. So I've left those right in front of the raised bed where they've been kind of permanently in the garden. I did put a few grow bags like in one layer around them, but they were not in the main pile kind of with all of the other plants. So those seem to be able to overwinter just fine in the Chicago weather. Now, if we were gonna have something like a polar vortex that we had a few years ago where it was like, was it -40, -50, I probably would have moved those closer or tried to bring them in for the few days that we had the terrible weather, but we didn't have that this year, luckily. But I think during kind of like an average typical winter, those are perfectly fine in their containers. I also had 3 containers of strawberries. Those were moved over in the corner, and those are just starting to have a little bit of green poking through, so I'm counting those as surviving. A rhubarb is coming back, and I'm really excited about that because this is the second year. I know I'll be able to harvest a little bit of it, but not as much as the third year, but I'm just excited it's coming back. I don't have to start all over from seed and go back to year 1. So I'm excited those came back. Ironia berry, that was, I think, the first thing that really budded up, and it's looking really great right now. I mentioned before in a video that I was thinking about getting rid of it. I am going to keep it because it's just making me happy, and I'll see if I like the berries, but the fact that it is just showing signs of life means that it gets a place in my garden. Next up, was that everything for edibles? Yes, that I overwintered. So other flowers that I overwintered, I had a rose tree. That one I got last fall because it was on sale. I actually already made my purchase at a garden center. I was leaving out the exit and I saw a rose tree that was, I think, 25% off. It was a good deal, so I got it. It was sitting in its nursery container over winter in that same pile in the corner. It's showing green on the stems, so I'm excited that that one is coming back. Next on my list are my 3 hydrangea bushes. So 2 of them, I think we are in the clear. There's some green buds that I can see. One of them was doing fine, and I think it was last week we had, again, just constant rain, a bunch of it pouring down, and I was looking through the window and I saw that the gutter, or water from the gutter, was like pouring right into the pot itself. Now, this wasn't anywhere near where the gutter is supposed to be pouring rain, but I think it was just so overflowing, and there was one lower spot in the gutter where everything was falling out, and that hydrangea happened to be right underneath it. So when I saw it, there was already water, so soil, water was up on top of it, spilling over the edge of the container. No matter what drainage was in the pot, there was just too much water being poured on it. So I moved it aside, I dumped the excess water out, and then I pushed it into a separate area, and I don't know if it's going to come back or not. I'm not seeing any signs of life yet. I did feel a couple branches that felt a little bit mushy, so I don't know if that one's gonna make it, which is gonna make me really sad, but that is just from the rain, and I think it would have been fine without it. So those are all of the plants that I overwintered. Basically, the things that did not survive were some of my bulbs, basically the bulbs that were not tulips, and then potentially one hydrangea, and again, that was due to recent rain not being left out in the winter. So I think as far as strategy, it seems to work to leave my container plants outside. Again, moving them all together so that they can be a little bit insulated, having some grow bags around them, but I think it worked out pretty well. So what I need to be aware of is any containers where I am planting bulbs that I want to come back in the spring. So here is my game plan for next winter. Basically, anything that is going to be small enough for me to carry, even if it means I'm taking 20 or 30 trips up and down the stairs, I'm going to store in the garage. That way I have total control over the weather and the moisture level that it's going to get. Now, I didn't have to water any of these plants at all when they were outside over winter. We get enough moisture, again, too much moisture for the plants to survive. So it will be an extra task for me to remember to check on them and give them some water, probably about, I'd say, once a month. But to me, I think it's a bit more worth it to have more control, maybe put in a little bit more effort on my part, rather than leaving them outside and kind of chancing the weather. So anything I can carry, I will move down. Anything that is too heavy for me to carry, because there are some containers that are too heavy for me to be able to lift and take downstairs, I'm either going to potentially just cover them with a tarp, or I can fit some under the raised beds. So if I push them under the raised bed, that gives them a little bit of protection from a lot of rain. Obviously, if anything's dripping through the raised beds, it'll get to them, but the soil is so thick in the raised beds, it's not like rain pours out the bottom. What I'm uncertain about is if I'm going to cover the raised beds with anything at all. So when we were getting a ton of rain and I was worried that my tulips were going to rot, I did take some patio furniture covers off of the furniture and put them on the raised bed. Again, I don't know if that did anything or not, but my tulips are here, so that makes me happy. But I'm trying to figure out if I need to cover them, again, just to give myself a bit more level of control of the amount of moisture that they're getting. So I'm not 100% sure on that yet. Let me know your thoughts. But overall, again, yeah, it seemed like larger containers did much better. Things that were not bulbs all survived, and the tulips within the bulbs that I planted all survived as well. So I'd say overall of what I overwintered, at least 80% of it survived. The bulbs that I lost, you know, it's a little bit sad that you lose something that you spent time planting, but you also learn from it. So anytime there's some sort of loss in the garden, I try to see it as, well, at least there's something that I've learned and I'll do better in the future. And so much of gardening is just trial and error. At least for me, it definitely is. But it is fun to just learn along the way and see what works and what doesn't. So that is my experience with overwintering the containers in my garden. Let me know what you do as far as overwintering. If there are certain things you do, maybe for certain plants versus others, things you are safe to leave outside, things that you need to bring inside. I think it'll just be interesting to kind of share everyone's experience with that. But this has been my experience. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.